Welcome, friends. My name is Frances. I'm the Director of Education here at Kendall Hill. And I'm standing before you filled with gratitude. I'm filled with gratitude for the food that we just shared, for the cooks and the workers here at Kendall Hill and outside who brought it to our table, and for the source of life who has made all of that nourishment possible and brought us here today. I'm grateful for the spring term cohort we mentioned in the dining hall. I'm wondering if friends can stand up if you are one of the scholars or students who has been living and working and worshiping here and is a resource for friends who are coming to join us for this gathering. Thank you. Thank you especially for one of them for pointing out that we haven't yet told you where the restrooms are, which is really important. They're out to the right and at the near where the front registration desk is. So please feel free to take care of your bio needs, and there will be coffee, another important bio need, and water out in the little kitchenette outside. I'm grateful to especially Anna Hill, the engagement coordinator, and Nathan, the director of operations, who are supporting us technologically tonight. And to Nathan's whole team, the operations team has been working so hard to make this possible. To our board members who are here, we could stand up so we can thank you. Thank you, friends. And to all of you, I invite all of us to stand for a moment. Please. This is what makes a community. This is what makes a beloved community. Each of you, we would not be whole without you. Thank you. With that, I'll introduce our first presenter. All of us here are participants. Some of us are also organizing or presenting things they prepared for us to learn together. I could not feel more grateful for Wendy Cooler to be opening our time together. Wendy is the assistant clerk of Sandy Spring Meeting and describes herself as a practical theologian, public minister, good Quaker pirate, and cultural worker. She has been an embraced public minister since 2018, traveling widely among friends with a concern for communities in crisis and Quaker family life. She is currently the convener of Testimonies to Mercy, a 7-part traveling retreat series on the future of Quakerism, as well as Life and Power, a discernment project with faith. Along with her spouse, she is co-editor of Friends Journal's news section. Wendy is the Kendall Hill 2020 Cadbury Scholar, the 2022 Fellow of the Interfaith NGO Odyssey Impact, and a current doctoral candidate at Lancaster Theological Seminary. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Earlham School of Religion, and she's joined up here by her elders, who she will introduce and for whom we also share our thanks. With that, I'll invite us into leading worship to prepare to receive Wendy's message.
Good evening, fellow provocateurs. Can you hear me okay? I worked very hard on this presentation, but I'm not really sure what I'm going to say to you this evening. I have slides, they're lovely. They were made by my friend Mandy Ford, who was an employee at Earlham School of Religion while I was there. She also made the stickers that were distributed, registrations. I love those. I realized just really like 2 days ago, I realized weeks ago what an impressive gathering this is. That in many ways, the group that is assembled here are, prophets among the religious society of friends. I look at the speaker list and, the list of participants and, the workshop titles. This is a provocative, prophetic gathering at a time when, for many of us, we perceive that the religious society of friends is falling apart. So this is, I think, the message that I'm going to deliver today is about this time of grief and this time of hope and this time of prophecy, this time of liminality, this time of potential, this time of pain and lament, and this time of intense togetherness. I was telling a friend of mine recently, so I am a public minister. A lot of my comments will be about public ministry. I know many of you are also engaged in public ministry amongst friends. And a lot of my presentation will be about the struggles of public ministry as well as the importance of public ministry. I realized I could talk to you about the struggles of public ministry because you're in it. And I'd like to offer a word of comfort to those of us who are in it. And I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone the other day, and I was saying, I just can't do this anymore. I don't make a living, I'm in a happy marriage, but if something were to happen to my marriage, I would just be so screwed. I don't have a retirement account of my own. And I know other people in public ministry who have literally lost teeth because they do not have dental insurance and they do not have the money to take care of themselves. And we persist year after year after year after year, giving of ourselves as servants in this community because we love each other. And sometimes we feel that there is a lack of practical love being returned to us. So this is about that. And this is for you. Many of us have in our homes a print by the Quaker artist Maggie Nelson. It's a block print or linoleum. And it shows Margaret Fell, who is often called the nursing mother of Quakerism. That's over here. I'm not very good with microphones. And underneath it are the words that Margaret often used in her letters to other Quakers. And it says, to paraphrase, let the light rip you open, provoke one another to love. Margaret is quoting there from Hebrews 10. Most of early Quaker writings are really patchwork assemblies of things that they had memorized from the Bible. The language she's drawing from is the King James translation of the Bible, which was published in 1611, just 3 years before she was born. So this access to the words of the Bible was brand new and exciting, and people of Margaret's class, because she was an upper class woman, memorized the Bible in response to having this access and could just speak in incredibly creative poetry like she did there. And I'm very fond of the phrase, provoke unto love. I'm very fond of the book of Hebrews in general. And when I have said this in workshops, invariably some friend stands up and says, Wendy, I'm really uncomfortable with your language right now. I'm really uncomfortable with the word provoke. Can't you use something less violent? Part of me is really tempted, you know, I am a working class person with a learning disability, but I'm also a person with a master's degree. And part of me, you know, gets a little saucy when I am told not to use the word provoke, and I am quoting the nursing mother of Quakerism who is quoting the Bible. But then, you know, should I get saucy? Like, is that what I'm called to do? Is that what it means to provoke love in this friend who is expressing this fear that I might be asking them to do violence in the world? I mean, I might be. Those of you that know me, you know, might have reason to suspect that. But you know, I'm not. We're talking about love. But, you know, it does have that connotation, the word provoke. And it has the connotation of trigger. And many of us know what it's like to be triggered in our meetings. I certainly know what it's like to be triggered in my meeting. My ministry for many years has really been around interpersonal violence. And it is a really uphill labor to talk to friends about interpersonal violence. It's very difficult for us to recognize that it happens in our own lives and to admit that to other friends and to go to them in all of our vulnerability and ask for help. I've also been provoked into struggle as a public minister, as I was saying earlier. I really question, from my experience as a public minister, the idea that people have to be provoked into labor. When I look around at my friends, my compatriots, my brothers and sisters, what I see is people being provoked to stop labor, at least labor for the common good. It's not resourced. So these determined, brilliant, prophetic people work and labor without even being invited to, without being supported in it. And yet the lie of capitalism, which many of us ascribe to, really, is that people have to be forced to give their labor to the common good. What people have to be forced to do is be corporate bankers, I think. Nobody wants to be that. Nobody says, you know what I'd really like to be when I grow up? I'd like to be an investment banker. As a matter of fact, studies have been done on that very question. And investment bankers are very often people who didn't do particularly well in Ivy League education. So these investment banks, they swoop them up. They give them jobs. They're like, look, we have people from Harvard. They're super smart. They're destroying the economy and everyone's lives. But they get paid a lot. That's what you have to force by under-resourcing work in the common good. I often get asked, what is public ministry? I'm not sure I have to answer that question in this space, but I will, or I will attempt to. So in the Christian tradition, the earliest Christians, the primitive traditions, after which Quakers believed themselves to be taking after, ministry was a position of service. There is absolutely nothing in the role of minister that meant that one was lording over other people. And we certainly see that in public ministry amongst Quakers. A public minister, so we are all ministers in the Quaker tradition, whether we take that seriously or not. And I fear that in our meetings, we are not provoking one another to take our role as ministers in each other's lives really deadly seriously. But a public minister in our tradition is someone who by definition has found their gift and calling somehow, I mean, honestly, and they are acting on that calling of God from within them, in their meeting and in the world. We might have a hard time with the phrase provoke in the way that it reminds us of violence, because Quakers prefer to be innocent to the violence that we do in the world. And that might be also why we have such a hard time really supporting public ministry, because these are the people provoking us to look at our violence, to engage with each other prophetically in the spirit of a loving God. I want to talk some about my power and identify myself. So I'm a white woman, I'm a cis woman, I'm a heterosexual woman. That is my experience of my body and my context. I also was a teenage mother. I'm also the survivor of domestic violence. I'm also neurodivergent, if you haven't noticed. I'm also working class. I'm also going to be Dr. Wendy at this time next year. I also struggle with a lack of resources. I'm also married to someone who supports me. I also travel to Europe and to Egypt and to Canada and California. I'm in a position of trust in many friends' lives. I have enormous joy in my life and enormous struggles. I'm a very complicated person. My faith is shaken loose, and it's also provoked by the hour. Sometimes I go home and I tell my husband about everyone I'm like that and how stupid everyone is. And sometimes those same people just shake me to my core, and I realize how wrong I've been to think of them the way I have, to be defensive around them, to refuse to allow myself to be provoked by them, to just dismiss them with some label. I want to read to you a poem, if I can read my own handwriting. I didn't write it. A woman named Maria Taviano, who is a survivor of domestic violence and also a survivor of the church, wrote. She describes herself, I describe myself as a good Quaker pirate. She describes herself as living wholeheartedly. And the name of this poem is Fake Boob. A nurse tried to make Audre Lorde wear a breast prosthesis after her mastectomy, because to go without would be bad for the morale of the office. And she was having none of it. I refuse to hide my body simply because it might make a woman-phobic world more comfortable, she said, and speaks of the dangerous fantasy of reconstruction. I feel this so deeply. I'm not putting a faith system back together just because people don't know what to do with someone like me. So I'm not here to put Quakerism back together. And I don't think anyone in this room is here to put Quakerism back together. So what are we here to do if we're not going to put anything back? I want to introduce my elders. Adria Galizia, Christy Randazzo, Judith Mamazzi. Can you say your last name again, Judith? Nandakova. I'm nervous and now I can't say it. I'm sorry. I love you. I'm so happy that they join me here as my elders, because in our lives together, these are three people I go to over and over and over again when I need help on the phone. Many people in this room have also served as elders to me, and I can't name you all, but I so appreciate you. I also want to call out my husband, Eric, my pirate-loving husband, Eric, who was recently telling me about a book by the anthropologist and anarchist, Dave Graeber, the posthumous book about pirates. And apparently there were good Quaker pirates. So I call myself a good Quaker pirate after the book Obadiah the Bold. Obadiah is a little 18th century Quaker boy that lives in Nantucket. He wants to grow up to be a pirate. Everyone says, no, Obadiah, you can't do that because pirates aren't good. And his father says, Obadiah, if it's your heart's desire to be a pirate, just be a good one. And I take great inspiration from that because our ideas of being good as Quakers are so limiting in my experience. And there is so much vastness to me. There is so much violence to me. There is so much inside of me that I can never just be good. But I can be a good Quaker pirate. So there really were Quaker pirates. And what we were hearing was that pirates were sort of proto-anarchists in the 17th century. They took a lot of their inspiration from Quakers and from other early speakers, and that they developed democratic societies, and that this knowledge of how to be in a democratic society, how to be together, was spread from mouth to mouth amongst the Quakers. And I asked myself, well, if there really were good Quaker pirates, because they took inspiration and they really were Quakers in some cases, how did this spread? Amid all this violence, how did this idea of how to be radically egalitarian together? The captain of a ship was, more like a clerk than anything else, it turns out. Like, how did this idea spread without violence, inside of violence? And I'm going back to the Quaker idea of God, the divine, and where God is located. And this theology really grounds my work and the remarks I'm going to make today. I seem to be making now. We will move past this slide, I promise. So God is in me. And God is in you. And God is in you. And God is in you. And God has to speak to God's self. And that's what we're doing in waiting worship. We quieten ourselves enough that God can speak to God's self. We respect each other so that God can speak to God's self. And I think that this is a biblical idea of God, because immediately after the passage in Hebrews 10 is Hebrews 11. And in Hebrews 11, the author talks about all the people who have been murdered. They've been sawn in two, they've been drowned, they've been burnt. And the author is calling out why. Why did this happen if there is a just God? Why did this happen when other people received the reward that was promised to them? How can it be that God has promised us a reward and yet our friends are being killed? And the answer that the author comes up with almost immediately after the section where they talk about provoking unto love The author says the reason for this is because only together can we be whole. Only together can we have the reward that is promised to us. So that is what we are called, to provoke one another to the reward we have in each other. But what can we say about that God that allowed so much violence if we were to revisit Hebrews 11? I mean, really? Like in the face of people being tortured to death, we're just going to say, oh, well, it's a lesson from God about how we need to be made whole together. And I think it's a lesson about trauma. That in order to be whole, we have to remember the trauma of our personal experiences. And that is what public ministry often is calling us to do. And we have to reintegrate those with trauma into the community. Trauma is not a psychological issue. It's a justice issue and a theological issue. So I don't want to remake a polite Quakerism. I don't want to remake the Quakerism of the past, the Quakerism that so many of us are so agitated by, in this room at least. I want to build the potential of a Quakerism that is in our hearts, in the God inside of us, the God that makes us work when we don't get paid. We're just so many things. We're violent and broken, and we're welcoming and we're brave. Next slide, please. So I see Jim Webner back there. He is the staff person at Sandy Spring, where I am assistant clerk. And I'm going to quote you, Jim. So the prophetic task, according to the theologian Walter Brueggemann, is to communicate pathos, which is sadness, and amazement. The prophetic task is to call us to grieve the things that we have lost. And it is to call us into a new reality. Serene Jones, a Presbyterian theologian, agrees. And she says, one cannot have great hope without simultaneously bearing great grief. And we want so badly in our meetings, like we know this, like I am so preaching to the choir here. Like we want to bypass that grief and go to hope, but there's nothing there without the grief. That's so much a part of our experience. It's the thing that we have to reflect on in order to move through the stages of trauma repair. We first have to remember the harm that has been done. And Jim, back there, Webner, he asked us in his study of the book by Walter Brueggemann, The Prophetic Imagination, in what ways are we tempted to resist this kind of speech? And how might we reconsider that resistance? What would it mean to accept our wisdom as adults in this community and to reject this false innocence that so many of our communities have clung to? What would it mean for us to speak wisdom into life? Next slide, please. So I talked some about the Quaker theology of where God is located. and how God is in communion with God's self. So in that way, our words are an expression of the divine in us. And Quakers are not the only ones to look to the mouth to see where wisdom is. In fact, babies across cultures do the same thing. Recently, MIT did a study of babies and toddlers across different cultures, different language communities, and they discovered that when babies are deciding who to bond with, they look to the mouth of the adults around them, and they see who is sharing food and who is giving kisses and who is saying kind words. And these are the people that they gravitate to. The MIT scientists, being MIT scientists, describe this as love and trust being about spit. But I don't think that if you were to hand an infant a vial of spit, they would say, thank you. You are now my friend. It is about the mouth. It's about the expression of the mouth. It's about sharing the very real need we have for food, for sustenance, the content of so many of my opening remarks as a public minister. When we lose people, it's often because they cannot meet their needs anymore. We remember John Woolman as a kind of Quaker saint, and there's a famous scene in his journal where a man asks to touch him where the words come from. John Woolman was a much better supported public minister than almost anyone in this room. And that's because at the time that John Woolman lived, Quakers recognized public ministers. They had systems for recognizing gifts. They had ways of supporting each other. They believed they were a community of connection and of mutual accountability. And they believed that they needed to meet each other's needs, even when they disagreed with each other, at least in some cases. What we have today is great wealth that's stored up in investments and antique buildings. And we have not invested in our people. Lori Sinitsky. The spotlight shines on you now. My friend Lori really wonders if we want to limit public ministry to those who can afford it. Do we? Like, do we only want to hear from retired people who had middle class jobs? Like, is that good for us? I mean, beyond just the justice issue, beyond the issue of connection, beyond the issue of people's needs, do we really want to only hear from the people who can self-fund their ministry to us? And if we do, what are the consequences of that? Well, I think we see them. We're dying. Sucking. And I kind of think we need to. And I'm not here to remake us. And I love us. I'm going to quote Maria Taviano again. I'm not putting a faith system back together just because people don't know what to do with someone like me. And I want you to consider in your heart, do you think our meetings need to be put back together? Are they broken? Is this an uncomfortable question? Yeah, it is an uncomfortable question. Up until about 3 years ago, every time I would say something like this, someone would say, probably the same person that would tell me not to use the word provoke. That person would say, our meetings are not dying. They're growing globally. You just sit down. But now, some of the most vital work going on among friends, the work that's being supported, is work that starts with the premise that our meetings are dying. It's very often work that centers around what to do with the resources of a meeting, but it's work that accepts the premise that our meetings are dying. We are in a completely different place than we were 3 years ago in terms of our self-understanding. It was strange a few years ago, but at the same time, I would get that response when I would be concerned about our meetings dying. I was doing work on interpersonal violence. And I very often got the reply, aren't you trying to kill our meetings? Are they that vulnerable? Like you just told me they were dying, we're growing globally, but we can't talk about interpersonal violence. We can't talk about sexual violence. We can't talk about racism. We can't talk about anything because you're trying to kill our meetings. Our meetings are both fragile and not fragile. It's like Schrodinger's meetings or something. Like, you know, what is happening? You know, and it makes sense, you know, like, but I also question myself and my testiness, like, where am I being provoked? What am I being provoked to do in response to this friend's anxiety? What can I do, really? Next slide, please. Our meetings live in the memory or an idea of them. We remember Benjamin Lay, the very smallest of the dolls here. But he was not a Quaker. He got written out of his meeting. But we claim him. We remember Benjamin Lay and his Bible full of poke-berry juice and his rusty sword. I've even said, this is my poke-berry juice moment before. But we remember him. And my friend Adria, who is serving as an elder, spotlights on Adria, recently was giving a public lecture at Earlham School of Religion where she made the point, and it was actually the first time I had heard this point, and it just was like, whoa, that's true, that's the truth. She said, Quakers did not manumit enslaved people for the sake of enslaved people. They manumitted enslaved people for the sake of their own souls. And that's what we're covering over. And we're like, Benjamin Lay's my favorite Quaker. He's your favorite Quaker written out of meeting Quaker, not a Quaker. And this fact was pointed out to me again. My husband and I went to Lynchburg, Virginia to see our niece's wedding last weekend. We went on a tour of the old meeting house there. It was nice. And there was this lovely young woman who was a history student giving the tour, and she read us a letter by a contemporary of Benjamin Lay's, whose name was Sarah Lynch Carroll. And Sarah, on her deathbed, had a vision of hell. And you're supposed to have a vision of heaven. She was having a vision of hell, and she called her family in and she said, we are all going to hell unless we manumit the people that we hold in bondage. I've had this vision. And then she died. So her husband and her children did manumit the people that they held, and they went to argue with their meeting, and they used her letter, her testimony, as support for that. But what do you hear in that? That's not about connection. That's not about real relationship. That's about being afraid to go to hell. Like that is a provocation in much the same way that one might be provoked to be a corporate banker. It's not a provocation to love. And we remember Margaret Fell, and she's a great feminist icon. She was also an upper class woman. She's also, who largely was responsible for the success of early Quakers because she protected them with her social class and she protected them with her money, something that many public ministers do not enjoy the protection of today, even though that is our earliest example. And if given the chance, we will visit Swarthmore Hall. I have visited Swarthmore Hall. And we get a thrill out of touching her incredibly expensive things. We went and we saw, so I travel a lot. And we went and we saw the first meeting house that was built, and Margaret would worship there. She sat in this like queenly carved chair apart from everyone. I got to sit in her chair. It's huge too. I don't know how big this woman was, but this was a big chair. And she sat there above all the other Quakers and their sheep and dogs that were gathered in the downstairs floor. But upon her death, she was buried in an unmarked grave. I don't know if she chose that or it was chosen for her, but that was how she was buried. She was buried in a sheep field, and we're not really sure where. So did Margaret undergo a transformation? And can we talk about that transformation, the possibility of that transformation, the transformation of our own lives by revisiting Margaret? Our history is important, but the way we tell the story, it's a fairy tale, and it's not serving us. And we have no way of moving from where we are today to where we want to be. We might know personally, because she worked at Aberford for a while, and I'm going to butcher her name as well. I'm so sorry. Nazizwi Malala Rutledge. Someone correct me if you know how to pronounce her name. Many apologies to her. Her life, she's a contemporary of ours, but do we have the right to claim her life? We love to quote her. She's all over the place. She was the Quaker second in command of the South African Defense Forces as a pacifist. She is an impressive lady. She said, if you want peace, prepare for peace. When we hear those words, do we understand what we're being called to do? Do we understand that we need to prepare ourselves for reality? You might know who Paul Cuffey is or was. He was a whaler and an abolitionist. His father was enslaved by Quakers. He was manumitted by the Quaker John Slocum, and Paul refused to call himself Slocum and adopted the name Cuffey. He sent freed men and women back to Sierra Leone. Do we recognize the God inside Paul Cuffey, the God that provoked him to use his time and his wealth that way, and to remove himself from white Quakers? We had done a great disservice to him. We had done great violence to him. And we might remember Alice Paul. She's a favorite. She fought for women to vote. But you might also remember that Quakers traditionally do not vote. It's the foundation of our business practices, actually, that we do not vote, that we make decisions together as the Spirit moves us. Is that a problematic history? Do we remember that? Do we talk about that? Do we talk about our own relationship to electoral politics in a critical way? Do we talk about the way we use power in our meetings in a critical way? And how is that impacting us, the people in this room? Because I suspect the people in this room are talking about power in a critical way in their meetings. And how is that met? We commune with our ideas much more than we commune with each other. And it's a constant source of sorrow for me. And so in this, I feel like I'm calling us into the prophetic task of grief. We grieve for these ideas of who we are. It just aren't true. They aren't right. They're broken ideas. They need to be labored with. There was a bestseller a few years ago called Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. And she talks in that book about how when you name something, when you collect it, it's a way of lording over it. The public ministers are not called to lord over other people, though we might like to go to the dentist. But our meetings lord over our history. And they lord over the idea of who we are. We've claimed it, we've collected it, we know what it is. We have pictures of these people, we have tea towels, we have pamphlets, we have everything. We have all the hagiographies, which means a biography that is overly positive and a bit of a fable. We wish to have control over our anxiety. But in doing that, we are killing the religious society of friends, and we are killing the potential of our connection to each other. Next slide, please. So my 17-year-old son, Ob, recently discovered joss paper. Joss paper is a quickly burning paper made of bamboo. It's used in Chinese traditional religion. It's a way of sending gifts to those that have passed. And he was just like on fire about this idea, which is, I'm using that to burn the paper. But, he loved this, like joss paper, like, wow. So he spent this like really happy day making origami ships and origami fish and origami this and that, and then poof, sending it to our ancestors or, sending it to someone else. And I was like, when I die, I need you to send me food every day. Like, go like make a representation of the food from my favorite restaurants and cool, there it is. Thank you, Ob. And he said he would. I'm imagining the chaos of this, and I'm imagining the chaos amongst, these real people and real ideas, that we keep sending these messages to. Oh, this is who you are. I've named you. I own you. Here's another gift. Benjamin Lay, you've been reinstated. But I want to ask us, amid all this chaos, amid these ideas, amid the deaths, amid the grief, where is their life? Next slide, please. Years ago, in response to the practice of Quakerism 101, which was hotly debated, did we welcome the newcomers? Did we explain ourselves? I was concerned with interpersonal violence, as I've said many times. And I remember, among the people I knew in my own life, and increasingly became aware of all the violence in our communities. And I remember there was a big brouhaha about how Nantucket Nectars had put on one of their bottle caps, Quakers in the past tense. Quakers used to live in Nantucket, something like that. And there are Quakers in Nantucket, they didn't like that. So there was a lot about, how Nantucket Nectars did this. And I remember saying, we complain that the world thinks we're dead. We apparently think we're dead because Quakerism 101 is often a collection of hagiographic accounts of people like Benjamin Lay, not even Benjamin Lay until a few years ago. But life is together. Life is in our meetings when we really engage one another. It doesn't really matter what it looks like, I think. You know, we show up in our messiness and our chaos as long as we are speaking the truth, which is what's hard. And as long as we're able to hear the truth, we are just sparkling with possibility. Poof, there's the truth. Poof, see you. Poof, I hear you. Next slide, please. So, in another accounting of Wendy's travels, I went to Egypt. I went to Egypt in January. And while I was there, I saw Tahrir Square, which is a place you might know, a place of liberty and a place of suffering. And I was just struck by all the ideas about Egypt. There's ideas in the modern world, and there's ideas in the Bible. And even in the Bible, Egypt is so many things. Egypt is the place that Joseph found refuge in after his own brother sold him into slavery. And then he offered refuge to his family in Egypt. And then Egypt was the place that enslaved those same people some generations later, and they had to leave. And that is a story of liberation. There was a story of liberation and protection to Egypt, a story of liberation out of Egypt, and then back into Egypt in the New Testament when Mary and Joseph take their infant son to Egypt to protect him from Herod. Like, if we can tell, like, these kinds, we have some practice, like, we have some models out there for how to tell a complicated story. Next slide, please. Our meetings are complicated places. And what I'm seeing right now, and what I am talking about when I say, oh my goodness, we are dying, and maybe we need to, and maybe we need to be something else. The thing that is breaking us, I think, is this cycle. And this is the heart of today's provocation is this cycle. This is a map of our uncomfortable reality. We're here to ask, in our multitudes, where is their life together made whole? And it's complicated by the fact that the task of public ministry seems to be prophetic urgency. Next slide, please. This is what I sound like, actually. You might find yourself here too. Often I'm talking to people that are more on the next slide, the people that are in grief, but I'm hearing urgency. And I have hurt people's feelings. I can be awful, actually, because I'm hurt. And I speak out of a place of trauma, and there's no container for it. So we speak out of urgency, and we demand, and we try to use our power to, control the meeting in some way and make the meeting do what we want it to do. In my case, that's usually been my child safety policy. Again, the rest of the world does it, might be a good idea. But, I will just start screaming about sexual violence if, left to my own devices. I've matured some in the last few years, but it is really hard for me to sit there and have some of the conversations I do about the violence in our homes and not have it taken seriously. So I will come to a meeting, and I have in the past used every ounce of my power and my influence to shame people into doing what I want them to do, what I think is righteous. And it never works. Because that's not discernment. It's not vulnerability. I can't go into a room loaded for bear and provoke love in someone else. You're never going to get anything good out of shaming someone else. And I've seen the same thing happen with racism. I want to say that. And I think that all of us have seen the same thing happen with racism. Next slide, please. And when we approach friends this way, we usually get grief back. This defensive posture. If you can get here, like sometimes people have really complicated defense postures and they don't even go to this place of vulnerable grief. But you very often will hear a message about how you are trying to destroy the meeting. I actually was in a conflict several years ago where I said that I wanted us to address sexual violence in a specific way. And my conversation partner finally just got mad at me. And he said, "What are you trying to do? We're already fighting about racism." So we're just stuck in this pattern of urgency and grief, of meeting each other. Both sides are trying to use all their power. The grief folks usually use Quaker process to stop things from happening. And the urgency folks are trying to use Quaker process to make things happen. And both are just, doing things outside of any kind of vulnerable, real discernment process where we can hear each other. And so we say that we're conflict avoidant. I think we're conflict avoidant. I think we like conflict. I think that what we are is engaged in unhealthy conflict. I think we are wedded to using our power inside of conflict. And there's some wisdom here. There's adult wisdom here. There's cleverness here. And are we prepared to take responsibility for the wisdom of our tactics? Are people like me, the urgency folks, am I willing to say, sorry, I was trying to use my power and, I recognize that I hurt you. We're such good peacemakers in the outside world. Is there a place for that? Is there a place to deconstruct these unhealthy conflicts we have in our meetings? I feel like I just keep delivering bad news, but I will also tell you about how people get disciplined in their meetings because I see it increasingly often. I'm asked because I'm very visible for accompaniment to people when they are being disciplined by their meetings. And usually the reason they're being disciplined is because they continue to try to labor with someone or use their power or some combination of the two that does not want to labor with them. And it's usually a justice issue. It's an issue about trauma. It's a justice issue around trauma. And what happens is the friend will say, hey, I've noticed something, would our meeting like to address it? And then the meeting is like, you are a good and virtuous person and what you need is a clearness committee. And they go to the clearness committee. And the clearness committee tells them, well, what they need to be clear about is not acting on that virtue. But they are a virtuous person, very virtuous. Don't do anything about that. The person's confused. It's very often a very weighty friend, someone that's used to being listened to. So they're confused. It's the first time it's happened to them. It's happened to me lots of times. But first time, so they think, oh, well, I'm just going to work on this inside a committee I belong to. and they go to their committee, and their committee likes them, their committee doesn't see what the problem is, the committee writes a statement or something. Guess what? That statement doesn't get read at business meeting. Something keeps happening. It's like a comedy of errors. It gets lost, it can't get published, it can't get talked about, blah, blah, blah. Like all kinds of things happen, and they're just like, why is it happening? I don't understand. And then, like, if they keep pushing it, somebody yells at them and is like, we will never read your minute. Then they get mad. Then they have an outburst in the course of business meeting. And then that gets met with like their friends coming to them. Their friends are like, you're a good and virtuous person. But their friends don't do anything in public to protect this person, to accompany this person in a meaningful way. So they get mad and they have more outbursts. And then before you know it, they're in mediation or in a clearness committee where they become clear that they need to not be on any committees until they can control themselves, and so on and so on. And many of these people eventually leave. That's what unhealthy conflict looks like in our meetings. It's just like it is like that whirling image I showed you. It's like your computer is just thinking, it's like, oh, what is happening? You know, until they just wear you out. And I don't have a magic way out of it because it keeps happening to me. Like this happens to me all the time. And so I suspect it's happening to you. Next slide, please. And I realize I'm talking much longer than I intended to, but I will. Is it okay? Okay. So, yeah, sorry, I forgot about this slide. This is people fighting in their meetings. That's what it looks like. All right, next slide, please. So, back to Wendy's sexy travels. I went. I was I was doing some research there on Britain early meeting safeguarding policies, which is what they call their abuse prevention measures. And while we were there, we did the pilgrimage, that's what it's called, or the 1652 tour. It's fabulous. I highly recommend it. But one of the things we did was we went to this place. It's called Fox's Pulpit. It's still a sheep field. So in 1652, before Fox was a household name, he wanted to be a household name, I do believe. And he climbed to the top of this thing. It's kind of a natural amphitheater. You can't see it here, but it's like a bowl after that point. He climbed up there and he addressed 2,000 seekers that were there for each other. It was like, you know, Lollapalooza for seekers or something. And they were all there and they had their picnics. And George Fox waited till the end of the day. He was written Fox, showman. He waited till the end of the day. He climbed up there and he preached about hireling ministers, which they all hated. They were hireling ministers because in their context, hireling ministers were people supported by their taxes. They were way away from London. And so they got the worst of the hireling ministers. That's where they sent their drunk hireling ministers. And they had to pay for these people to come and misuse them. They didn't like them. And they were also far enough away from London to organize. They were organizing themselves here in this beautiful field. These fences were actually built around the time of Jesus, like shortly after Jesus lived, by the Roman occupiers. And so I just have this vision of, you know, the primitive Christians gathering with these stones laid by the occupiers who, you know, according to stories, you know, killed Jews. And so while I was there, I noticed that there was erosion. And actually, this is a piece of Fox's Pulpit, if you'd like to touch it. I did steal it, but I stole it. I stole it with permission. I didn't hurt Fox's Pulpit because there's just pieces of stone everywhere. It's been crumbling for thousands of years. And so there's this place of life and history and longevity and crumbling. Next slide, please. Actually, would you like me to pass this around? Do you want to touch George Fox as well? And I want us to touch the uncomfortable wisdom that our meetings are always humbling to. We can't control them. We, the living, are the life in them. And life is chaotic and uncontrolled. God in us is always talking to God's self, the God in you. I'm going to tell a story that I've told a lot recently, so some of you can sing along. It's from the Brothers Grimm. It's the story of the moon. Lori knows this story. So, according to the story, a long time ago, there were 3 thieves. And these thieves climbed a long stairway to get to the moon, and they pulled the moon back down to Earth, and they split it into 3 pieces. And the moon was absent from the sky, so the sky was dark, but they had their 3 giant pieces of the moon, and other people wanted them and being in business together. They were like the investment bankers of their time. They split the moon up into small pieces, and they sold them. And then those pieces appreciated in value, and those people sold them until most people had one very tiny little piece of the moon, and that's how they walked around at night. And the moon kind of appreciated to such a degree, it was such a treasure that people wanted to be buried with this piece of the moon. And so pretty soon, the whole world was left in darkness when night came, and all the light was under the ground with the dead. We're going to return to that story. For now, next slide, please. I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but I want to give you a model for how we can interrupt this cycle of urgency and grief and unhealthy conflict. So Alana Newhouse, there's a Jewish periodical called Tablet, and Alana Newhouse in Tablet provoked some major conversation in the Jewish world by suggesting that Tablet was having a fight amongst itself, that the writers were having a fight amongst themselves. And it was because some writers believed that the world was broken, that all Jewish institutions and all institutions of the world were broken, and we needed to abandon them. And there was another contingent that she called the status quo contingent, and they were like, look, we just need to fix these up the way they used to be. They won't be broken anymore. We're going to move on. And that sounds a lot to me like the urgency grief thing that we see going on in the Quaker world. And so we can break this with the shock of provocation. And this is our call as public minister. There's some talk right now about being the Quakers that the world needs, and I'm all for it. But how can we be the Quakers anybody needs without doing this work on ourselves? The next slide, please. So we're going to go back to George Fox's pulpit, covered in clover. And this is what's alive beside the sheep there. And a clover is in the shape of a triangle, like many things in nature are, because the triangle is the strongest shape in nature. The triangle depends on every corner to maintain its stability. You can see this in human relationships. It's why we call, when you get sucked into a conflict where you don't belong, it's called triangulation. That comes from family systems theory. And family systems theory acknowledges that triangles are what all human relationships are. It's not just a bad word for being sucked into someone else's mess. All of our relationships have a third person or a third thing in them, and that's how they are stabilized. that we need to give testimony and have that testimony witnessed. And we need to be in communion with a third thing for that to happen most effectively. And so here I want to propose that our triangle as public ministers relies on us. It also relies on recognizing trauma inside of our communities. And it also depends on corporate discernment. All three of these things are things that I've addressed a little bit in this lecture so far. We're going to go a little bit more deeply on each of them now in a more hopeful vein. But I want you to recall how each of these things has interacted with the others as we have engaged in the work of lament throughout this lecture. Actually, I want to recognize, I wrote this in my notes, and I want to shine a spotlight on Christy Von Dawson. Speaking of the triangle, since I've gone over anyway. So Christy recently gave an amazing lecture. And that lecture was on Quaker theology. And Christy pointed out that our testimonies are interrelated like this as well. That we can't have a peace testimony without having a testimony to equality. And we can't have those without a testimony to integrity and so on. That our entire foundation is built on triangulation and the interrelationship of each of the things that makes our communities, that makes us whole together. Next slide, please. But here's a problematic image. This is my image for corporate discernment. So this is the peaceable kingdom, by Hicks. It's an image that was born out of trauma, the trauma of the Hicksite Orthodox split. Hicks is imagining that, all Quakers can kind of live in peace together. And they are represented by these animals. And then he takes inspiration over here in the background from William Penn making a treaty with Native people. But that's crap. Like, we know that's crap. We do. And so, when we look at this image and we look at our history, so many people in this room are like, that's crap. And why would I want to engage in corporate discernment with these people that hang this crap thing up in all of their buildings? Like, how can I trust these people? So recently, French General Conference invited me and a colleague of mine, Stephanie Kriebel, who's a former Mennonite, to present on the film Women Talking. And Women Talking is a film about sexual violence, but more than that, it's a film about corporate discernment. These women sit in a barn together and they engage in the discernment of how to respond to violence against them and their children. Ultimately, they decide that pacifism requires them to leave. It's also a problematic film in many ways. Stephanie would like you to know it's not about Mennonites, for instance. But it could very well be about Quakers. And someone asked in the course of our presentation on that film, why corporate discernment? Like they were just confused about how survivors might be interested in discerning a response to violence in our community. And they said, power is used in our corporate discernment processes, that power in the outside world shows up in our meetings when we try to do corporate discernment. And I was like, yeah, it does. See previous comments about the path to discipline in your meeting. It happens to me. But I'd like you to ask yourself in this space, is there anything else? Do you really think that power in the outside world is not going to show up when you hire an expert to tell you what to do? do you really think power in the outside world is not going to show up when you appoint someone to make a decision for you? So we're stuck with each other. There's no way out of this. And we have to work with the crap and the annoying people in order to get a future that we actually want together, to actually love each other. So that's the first part of the triangle. Next slide, please. The second side of the triangle is about trauma. So people ask, what is trauma? What are you talking about? Next slide, please. So a workshop here, actually, that I gave in the fall, that you can take online from Woodbrook next fall if you like. We answered the question, what is trauma? And what we decided was that given Quaker theology, that God is inside of us and God needs to be in communion with God's self, what trauma is, as a theological concept as opposed to a psychological one, is a separation from the divine within us and from each other. And you can see how vital it would be to address this definition of trauma in order to engage in meaningful corporate discernment in our meetings for worship and in our business meetings. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk about where trauma happens, because I think that a misunderstanding of this is at the root of a lot of our unhealthy conflict. I think our unhealthy conflict, if you talked to me 10 years ago, I would have told you that our unhealthy conflict was a result of our vanity and our cowardice, because I was mad. And that might have something to do with it. However, I think a lot of our unhealthy conflict actually comes out of how deeply we need each other, how deeply we need to be loved. And we'll accept partial love if it means not total hate. So we misunderstand and we think that when trauma happens, we're like, oh, connection, that's really like connection. Oh, rupture hurts. And repair is good. You know, we see the moon there in the sky. These people are talking to each other. Like, yeah, repair. That's great. So I just want you to do a thought experiment and ask yourself, where do you think trauma happens? Where are we separated from the divine in this? Yeah, it's in repair. It's because repair doesn't happen correctly. We don't know how to apologize. Does your meeting apologize for anything? Really? No. You know, and so there's no process there. Like, we have not built process. We have not built processes of repair. So like, we are in living relationships, and in living relationships, rupture happens all the time. Like, I find with my husband. You know, like, that's what happens. You have connection, you have rupture. Connection, you have rupture. That's what being alive is. It's chaos. Poof, poof, poof. You know, and we have to be in constant, you know, we have to dance around that. But we dance around that with repair. That's the third part of this trauma triangle. Use that metaphor again. The next slide, please. So I wanted to offer us, I'm spending a lot of time on trauma because I think it's like the #1 problem. It's like the corner of this triangle that's just messing up public ministry and messing up corporate discernment, something fierce. So Judith Herman is a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, and she's probably the preeminent scholar on trauma. And she has offered a pretty simple, easy to understand path towards good repair work. And this is something I'd encourage you to take back to your meeting and labor with this. So she says that the first thing you have to do in engaging trauma is create safety for the traumatized person. That needs to be physical safety and psychological safety, that no work can happen outside of there being a safe environment. And so in the context of a meeting, might that look like building the first aid kit? Might that look like preparing for peace? Might we have a plan about how to deal with things that are normal in people's lives, things we know exist in the world and in our families? And then secondly, after the traumatized person is safe, she says we have to engage in the work of reconstruction, which for her means memory. It means the telling of the story. It needs to be able to be told in the light and a safe environment as many times as the traumatized person needs to share it in whatever language they need to use, however that might provoke us. And so in the context of a meeting that has limited resources, I would say, we're not necessarily professional counselors. And if we are, we don't need to be counseling people in our meetings. We might ask ourselves, how can we provide companionship? How can we accompany people even when we need to call on professional help? And do we have relationships with people that outside of our meeting that we can call on to consult in these situations? And the third thing, according to Herman, is reclamation, which is the reintegration into the community. And I'd like us to ask what a fully accessible meeting might look like. But I think that's the goal if we want to be whole with each other. How do we translate our understanding of injustice into this preparation? How does our meeting respect diversity? How do we lift up those experiencing hurtful things? This is going to require time, tenderness, and labor. How do we engage in that labor with the full integrity of our wisdom? Next slide, please. So it's you, most of you, maybe all of you, you're public ministers, It's like the meeting of the prophets. It's so exciting. You're the answer. You're the answer to the third part of the triangle. I actually wanted to end this presentation, and we are near the end here. I wanted to end this presentation with a montage of public ministers dancing to Your Love Is Lifting Me Higher. I was like, that's going to bring the house down. But nobody wanted to take me up on it. Some people were like, well, that sounds like fun, and they never sent me one. But I think, it's just as well. Because you're the provocateurs. We are the people who need for resources. And I'd encourage us to go back home and stand up for ourselves and lock arms and do something about the resources we need to transform the religious society of friends and the vision that we have and the prophetic vision that we have together and the power we have together. There's nothing wrong with using your power. Use your power. But use your power to engage in discernment. Use your power to provoke other people to love. Use your power to provoke yourself to love. So Johann Muir actually gave, and he's alive. You might know him. He gave a similar talk. So it was on public ministry, just public ministry in 2000 for Canada Year Meeting. I can send it to you if you'd like. It's great. And he said it's important to take public ministry seriously, to not give into, my words, the false innocence that it just like doesn't exist, just like trauma doesn't exist in our meetings. And he said it's important because the minister is calling for the attention of the whole meeting. And our response to that is so often that we joyfully but uncritically identify that we have grown out of public ministry, but we do nothing to support it today. And what would the antidote to that be? It would be transparent, critical, vulnerable approaches to Quaker history and theology that celebrate and mourn our lives together. Johann said it's important to take public ministry seriously because, for one thing, the minister may be making a claim on the resources of other friends. Heck yes. Yes, I am. I would like to be able to support myself. I would like to not leave public ministry in a year when I'm Dr. Wendy because I can't support myself and I'm 46 years old. So the way our meetings respond to this is many meetings are ambivalent towards material and spiritual support. And spiritual, I would say, and spiritual. Like how many people have a recording at their meeting? How many people are embraced or released at their meeting? Like almost no one. I am. Yeah. I mean, yeah, high five. But like, it's so hard to even receive spiritual support, much less material support. Even though we also celebrate individual traveling ministers. Like we're like rock stars, you know, like we get invited to do things and people are like, tell me what you think and let me call you and then tell you about my life. And, you know, so we celebrate this, but like there is real vulnerability there where we are celebrating individual traveling ministers whose ministries have not been discerned by their community. Because their community is not able to. What it means is there's a lack of accountability. And what it means is that people who are not public ministers can end up in positions of unofficial power and authority because we think we know who they are. So a solution to this would be a non-anxious, proactive, and radically accessible educational presence for Quaker communities that demystifies the values and techniques of discernment. Hello, Kendall Hill. And the third thing that Johann says is a reason to take people seriously is that effective persuasive public ministry has a kind of power. You see that. But the way our meetings often confront that is through a lack of important educational support and networks for promoting new ways of being and seeing. So that power just gets squished. And the antidote would be well-funded conferences, non-academic writing and speaking opportunities, grants, para-meeting eldership for public ministry. Next slide, please. You like this? I like this. So it's really messed up. I took it out. And I was like, well, I was denied your love is lifting me higher, so I'm just gonna go with it. But this is, you know, all of our history together. And I want, and all of who we are together, all the life and all the brokenness. And I want to address that moon that's in the sky there on a perfectly lit day for some reason. And I want to finish that story by the Brothers Grimm. So ultimately, in that story, it's night and the dead begin to get restless. They are starting to move around under the ground because the light is keeping them from their rest. So they climb up out of their graves with their little pieces of light and they start bumping into the living at night. And this is very disturbing to the dead and even more disturbing to the living. Imagine meeting Benjamin Lay out there with like a little twinkly thing. That would be bad. So you would be real quick to be like, you need to be written out of your meeting right now. But you know, that it was very disturbing, and they managed to discern together a solution to this problem. And that was the dead would give the living back these little pieces of the moon. And together, the living would climb back up into the sky and put each of these little twinkling pieces back in the sky. So that the moon was back where it belonged, and the dead could rest, and the living could live. Next slide, please. So I want to finish by reading from Hebrews. Let us hold fast to the possession of our faith without wavering. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love, to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, but exhorting one another. And so much more as you see the day approaching.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, friend. Thank you, Lori, for everything you did to help birth this gathering. And I understand now why that we have to have Wendy Cooler here. We talked briefly about having a question and answer. And not only because Wendy was so generous with her message, but also because I think the rest of this gathering is going to be our question and answer. We'll wrap up here. Praying that this gathering can be an opportunity for God to speak to God's self. Hoping it can be a space of connection. Expecting if we manage to make connection, there may be rupture. And most of all, praying this can be a space to learn repair. There's so many gifts of repair in this room, and I'm so excited to learn with you. I'd like to close with worship, and then we'll share some logistics after making space for gratitude and leading worship. Thank you, friends. Go well, those of you commuting home, travel safely. Friends can find their rooms and we will reconvene. There is a optional Tai Chi offering in the library tomorrow morning at 7:15. It's a new addition to the schedule. breakfast is from 7:30 to 8:30, and we'll meet back here at 8:30 for meetings for worship. So welcome.
If you have my piece of George Fox's pulpit. I will write that down. Okay, thank you.